In 2003, engineers finished a runway that had no land left to sit on, so they built 180 concrete pillars straight down into the Atlantic, rising up to 70 meters from the seabed, and paved a runway across the top of them, out over open water. A road runs underneath it. Waves break against the columns holding it up. Planes now land on a platform floating above the ocean, and most of the passengers walking off never look down to notice. To understand why, you have to go back to 1964. Madeira never had room for an airport. It's a volcanic island, all cliffs and mountains, rising almost straight out of the Atlantic with barely any flat ground anywhere near the coastline. Engineers searched the shoreline and found exactly one narrow shelf of land wedged between the peaks and the sea, near the town of Santa Cruz. They carved a runway into it. It was short, barely long enough for the propeller aircraft of the era, and nobody involved expected it to hold anything bigger. Then the jet age arrived. Tourism discovered Madeira, and airlines wanted in. The runway that was never built for jets suddenly had to carry them anyway. The island gave the airport almost nothing to work with. Mountains rose directly behind the runway, channeling unpredictable winds straight down onto final approach. The Atlantic sat immediately in front of it, cutting off any room to extend outward. On one side, solid rock. On the other, open water. The runway could not grow in either direction without pushing into something that was never meant to hold one. So pilots learned to fight the wind instead of avoiding it. Crosswinds rolling off the mountains could shift direction and speed within seconds, slamming the aircraft sideways just as it crossed the threshold. Sometimes the wind wasn't even steady enough to call a crosswind. It came down in rotor turbulence, tumbling off the peaks in invisible waves that could drop an aircraft's wing without warning. To stay clear of the high ground, pilots flew a curved, offset approach, banking around the terrain rather than straight into it, correcting constantly, wings rocking, throttle adjusting by hand through the final seconds before touchdown. Landing at Madeira required a captain-specific qualification. A standard type rating wasn't enough. You had to be checked out on this exact airport. In a simulator, rehearsing the same crosswind correction over and over, before you were allowed to attempt it with real passengers on board. Even qualified crews were briefed to abandon the approach and divert the moment the numbers crossed a hard limit. There was no version of this airport that tolerated improvisation. For the people who lived under it, the crosswind approach became something closer to spectacle than routine. A stretch of coastal road near the runway's edge turned into an unofficial viewpoint, where locals and tourists gathered with cameras to watch jets crab in sideways, nose pointed at an angle to the runway centerline, wings tilting at the last second as the pilot kicked the aircraft straight just before the wheels touched down. Regulars said you could tell how bad the wind was that day just by the angle of the nose on final. On the roughest afternoons, arriving flights would circle offshore for 20 or 30 minutes, waiting for a break in the gusts, and departing aircraft sat on the apron with engines running, while dispatchers watched the wind readouts tick up and down. Because the runway was short, there was almost no margin for error on touchdown. Land too fast, too far down the strip, or flare too late, and there simply wasn't enough pavement left to stop before the end. On November 19th, 1977, TAP Air Portugal Flight 425 came in for landing in heavy rain and gusting crosswind. The aircraft touched down long and bounced, and the crew's attempt to go around came too late to matter. It ran off the end of the runway, down the embankment, and broke apart before catching fire. 131 people died. It remains one of the deadliest accidents in Portuguese aviation history, and the investigation traced it back to the same three conditions residents of the island already knew by heart: a short runway, unstable wind, and nowhere left to extend. The crash forced a reckoning decades of near misses hadn't. Portuguese aviation authorities knew the runway had to get longer, but there was still nowhere for it to go. Cutting further into the mountain meant moving an enormous volume of rock at extreme cost. With no guarantee the wind problem would improve, extending into the water meant building on nothing at all. In 1986, engineers extended the runway modestly using landfill, pushing it out just far enough to add a real margin of safety. It helped. It wasn't enough. The crosswinds hadn't gone anywhere. The mountains hadn't moved an inch. and the runway was still too short for the wide-body jets airlines increasingly wanted to fly in from mainland Europe. By the late 1990s, officials approved something that had never been attempted at this scale on a commercial runway anywhere in the world. Extend it by building a platform straight out over the ocean, supported entirely on pillars driven into the seabed. Construction crews sank 180 concrete columns into the Atlantic floor, some reaching down 70 meters to anchor into bedrock beneath the waves. Each pillar had to be driven and poured individually. In open water, timed around swell and weather windows the engineers couldn't control. Across the top of those pillars, they poured a concrete deck wide and strong enough to carry a landing, Boeing or Airbus at full weight, engineered to flex slightly under load without transferring stress into the columns beneath it. The project took years and cost hundreds of millions of euros, funded in part through European Union infrastructure funding, because there was no version of this fix that came cheap. Underneath the runway today, there's nothing but open air, ocean swell, and a coastal road threading through the forest of pillars below. The extension added almost a full kilometer of usable runway, nearly all of it suspended above water. It opened in 2003. For the first time, wide-body aircraft could land here with a real safety margin instead of a gamble. The wind never left. Pilots still fly the same curved, offset approach, past the mountains, still correct by hand through the final turn, still need the airport-specific qualification before anyone lets them try it with passengers aboard. What changed is what happens in the seconds after the wheels touch down. There's finally enough runway left underneath them to stop. But building a runway out over the sea buys a new problem instead of solving an old one. Salt air corrodes exposed steel and concrete far faster than it would on solid ground. Engineers now inspect the underside of the platform on a strict, recurring schedule, sending crews down among the pillars to check for corrosion damage from decades of ocean spray, storm surf, and Atlantic gales battering the columns from below. A runway built to escape the constraints of the island now has to be defended against the ocean it was built directly on top of, permanently, for as long as it's expected to carry a single aircraft. In 2017, the airport was renamed after the island's most famous export, a footballer who grew up a few kilometers from the runway, watching the same jets fight the same wind over the same narrow strip of rock his entire childhood. The original 1,964 runway is gone in the sense that nobody lands on that exact stretch of pavement anymore, but it's still down there, underneath everything. The first sliver of concrete the entire ocean platform was eventually built to extend. When you look at the history of this island, the story keeps repeating itself in a new shape. First, they wedged a runway between a mountain and the sea. Then, when that wasn't enough, they extended it by building straight past the edge of the land, out over open ocean, resting the whole thing on pillars driven into the seabed. Every fix solved the problem in front of it, and quietly inherited a new one. The mountain gave way to the water gave way to concrete, and the concrete now spends every year of its existence defending itself against the very ocean it was built on top of. One inspection, one recoated pillar, one storm season at a time, for as long as anyone plans to keep landing here.